On behalf of Team Sign Up Training, I thank you all for participating in this interactive webinar. It's on harassment, discrimination, and the manager's role in workplace investigations. So,
Thank you. All right, everybody. Thanks for your patience and thanks for hanging in there, and thanks to our moderator today as well. Let's just kind of start from the very beginning. I don't really know who you are or what you do or what your industry is or any of that. I do know the workplace is changing and expectations of employers are higher. The standards for what is offensive is lower. Employers are largely better informed. While interestingly, we have a better informed group than we have others who just don't seem to get it that the world has changed. And the fear to speak up is eroding. So this is largely all good in my estimation, that, our expectations are higher, and that we're better informed and we'll speak up. I mean, those are all good things, right? Okay, so let's start. So what is discrimination? Well, you can tend to discriminate. I used to, not that long ago, work for a fellow who said, I don't hire women to work in the warehouse. Not because they couldn't lift as much, but he went on to say, I don't hire women to work in the warehouse because they get pregnant and then they're out for 12 weeks. Okay, well, he would intend to discriminate. And you can also have non-intentional discrimination, whereas you don't intend to discriminate, but your policies or procedures have the effect of doing so. And so, for example, pay is a great one on this one, where some people will negotiate harder. And, there's a lot of science out there that shows that men will negotiate harder than women for pay rates. And there's also some really frustrating science out there, in my opinion, that shows when we women negotiate in the same manner as the men do, that we're not seen as good negotiators. We're seen in a less unfavorable light and less likely to accomplish our goals. Yeah. And but we're not gonna solve that here. So what happens, and I saw this happen at a place I used to work, what happens is the men over time end up starting out at higher pay rates, which wasn't intentional, but it still had the effect of being discriminatory. So that could be considered non-intentional. So as a supervisor, what you want to do is just carve out protected classes from your decision making. She's pregnant, doesn't matter. He's this religion, doesn't matter. You carve out the protected classes from your employment decision making, and your decision making occurs all the way from when you start and from where you decide to recruit employees, all the way through to who you decide to hire, promote, demote, downsize, right size, and how you handle their exit packages, even their references. Those are all employment decisions. If you teach, sometimes I had somebody one time say, Terry, do you want to get rid of all the sex and drugs and rock and roll in the workplace? And I said, well, I want to get rid of all the drugs, and I don't want to get rid of the rock and roll. But at the same time, if I made it the only thing I did all week long, I'd still probably only eradicate about 80% of the sex from the workplace. However, that's only 20% less that you have to deal with, right? And so if you are creating an atmosphere of respect and an appreciation for diversity in your workplace, then you're going to be setting a tone where you very likely don't have these big problems to deal with, because they just never get there. If you go into a workplace and if someone says to me that they've got a supervisor that's running what I like to nickname club hedonism, then the first person I'm looking at is a supervisor, because there is no way the club hedonism is running without, if not their approval and environment, at least them looking the other way. Club hedonisms just don't occur in places where the supervisor creates a tone of respect and diversity. So what is harassment? I know technically it's harassment, but sometimes, if you said harassment training, some of your employees wouldn't even know what you were talking about. You'd go all the way through harassment training and they wouldn't even know what you were talking about. So we're going to call it harassment. All right. Now, this is straight from our friends at the EEOC. What is harassment? Okay, what's the conduct? Let's start with sexual. Sexual harassment the conduct consists of unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature so the conduct constitutes sexual harassment when an employment decision affecting that individual is made because the individual submitted to or rejected the unwelcome conduct. Basically, that's called quid pro quo. Layman's Latin, this for that, sleep with me or get fired. Now, notice the individual in number one here, the individual submitted to or rejected. So it doesn't matter if they sleep with you or they rejected it. Just the fact that an offer has been made of that nature constitute sexual harassment. Now, the second bullet here, number 2, is what we call hostile environment. And that's when you have that conduct that's in the second bullet, and that conduct unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance or creates an intimidating, hostile, or abusive work environment. So notice, and it's kind of the severity and pervasiveness of the conduct. And so you can have conduct that doesn't breach the definition of the law. At the same time, I would like to point out that you can have conduct that it might not break the law, but it violates the policy. And so the company decides that they don't want that in their particular workplace. So you don't have to break the law to get fired for violating the policy in most workplaces. And now it's not only sexual harassment. So if we went up here and we put in, let's go to hostile environment. So if we were to say sexual conduct that's unwelcome, of a racist nature, okay, it interferes with a reasonable person's work performance, or we were to say conduct of an ageist nature that is unwelcome and it's intimidating, hostile, abusive work environment. Okay, so we could basically take any protected class, and while it might not quite fit in there grammatically, we can certainly see that if it's conduct, severe and pervasive, and interferes with a reasonable person's work performance, we may have definitely met that standard, or we could have violated the policy, remember? All right. In Burlington Industries and Farragut City of Boca in 1998, the Supreme Court took up the question of, okay, how employers, what do you have to do? And so the standard of liability set forth in those two Supreme Court decisions is premised on two principles. An employer is responsible for the acts of its supervisors. Because, see, employers, you give these people this authority and you allow them to make these decisions. And so you can't say that they were making decisions or doing things that, you weren't responsible for. And 2, employers should be encouraged to prevent harassment, and employees should be encouraged to avoid or limit the harm from harassment. And so to accommodate those two principles, they set forth what is known as the limited affirmative defense. And that includes, so basically, employer, if you want to avoid liability or limit damages, the way that you do it is by establishing this affirmative defense that incorporates those two principles by showing the 2 bullets on the bottom here, that the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent and correct promptly any harassing behavior. Okay, so your prevention is your training, it is your policy, and it is you on a day-to-day basis as a supervisor setting the tone of respect. And then correct promptly. Correction is your prompt, good faith investigation. And then if it's determined that that behavior did occur, that you stop it and you rectify any harm caused as best as you can. So there's really 2 things in that, first sentence there. What does it mean the employee unreasonably failed to take advantage of any preventive or corrective opportunities provided by the employer or to avoid harm otherwise? Basically, did they report? Those are your preventive or corrective opportunities that are provided by the employer. Did they report? Now, so here's the deal. As a supervisor, you are not only instrumental in setting the tone, but you are instrumental in the employee. If they report, you have to get it to the proper person in your organization to correct, meaning to investigate. So if you don't pass on these complaints, you can basically drop the ball for the whole team. And at the same time, if you don't set a tone that is respectful, you're going to get these complaints. Now, then we had a Supreme Court decision from 2013. The standard for employer liability for hostile work environment harassment depends on whether or not, typically on whether or not the harasser is the victim supervisor. An employer is vicariously liable for a hostile work environment created by a supervisor. So basically, what that means is if you have a supervisor who participates in quid pro quo harassment, then you basically have what's called strict liability. And if I skip to the middle of this paragraph here, the court, meaning Supreme Court, stated that an employer is liable for hostile work environment harassment by employees who are not supervisors if the employer was negligent in preventing and failing to prevent harassment from taking place. So now that adds on another layer to that as well. Also relevant is evidence that an employer did not monitor the workplace, failed to respond to complaints, failed to provide a system for registering complaints, or effectively discouraged complaints from being filed. Okay, so you're a supervisor if the employer has empowered that employee to take tangible employment actions. So another layer on top of that. Now, remember we said that employer, if you participate in quid pro quo, then and there is an adverse employment decision taken, then the employer has strict liability. If there is not an adverse action taken, then you might be able to raise that affirmative limited defense. But if you actually took an adverse action on quid pro quo, there's strict liability. There's also strict liability by the alter ego of employers. So presidents, owners, partners, corporate officers. So now you have, so you can have other individuals who harassment could be imputed automatically to the employer. Now, what about failing to complain? What about this employee unreasonably failed to complain or otherwise depends harm? As they point out, it's the particular circumstances and information available to the employee at that time. I'd like to point out to you the second sentence there. An employee should not necessarily be expected to complain to management immediately after the first or second incident of relatively minor harassment. Workplaces need not become battlegrounds. An employee might reasonably ignore a small number of incidents hoping that the harassment will stop. The employee might directly say that they want the misconduct to stop and then wait to see if that happens. So the employee doesn't, there's kind of this misnomer out there that the employee has to tell the person to stop. They don't have to tell them, but they can. They can just come and complain if they want to. At the same time, sometimes employers will say, well, why'd you let it go on for 6 months? Which is not a good question, because that immediately implies that the victim is to, the alleged victim is to complain. Well, because they might have been hoping it would stop. They might have been overlooking it. They might have told the employee to stop, but they don't have to tell their coworker to stop. They can just go and complain. But sometimes there certainly can be a delay here. There can also be a reasonable explanation for employees' delays by thinking that the complaint mechanism is going to entail a risk of retaliation. There were obstacles to complaints. The complaint mechanism was not effective. So to show that the employee didn't come forward, the employer must prove that the belief or perception underlying the employee's failure to complain was unreasonable. But I can honestly tell you that most complaint mechanisms in most companies, they do entail a risk of retaliation. There are often obstacles created to complaints, and the complaint mechanism is often not effective. You can have the best policy, you can send people to how to investigate class all you want to, but the reality is those three things are often still there in most companies, and they create a risk for the company. Because as we said, and the idea of not being retaliated is very inherent in the protections. An employer should make clear it's not going to tolerate adverse treatment of employees because they report harassment or provide information related to such complaints, such being a coworker. And your policy and complaint procedure will not be effective without such an assurance. But if your complaint procedure is not, it doesn't prohibit retaliation, it doesn't matter how good your policy is, it'll just be wallpaper. So management should undertake whatever measures are necessary to ensure that retaliation doesn't occur. And so one of the things, I just got back from teaching an investigations class, and so one of the things we do is for the investigator to tell the employee making a complaint of the anti-retaliation stance, to make sure they know how to contact the investigator, that they must report complaints of retaliation, and to just pick up the phone and call if they feel that there's something suspicious happening to them that's related to this investigation. We tell that to witnesses as well. And then afterwards, I teach them when the investigation is closed to make proactive, that to have a closure meeting with the person making a complaint, but then also to make proactive efforts to check back around to make sure the employee is not being retaliated against. And in your closure meeting, you tell the employee that you list out your anti-retaliation stance again, and make sure they know how to contact you, and that they must report not only any further incidents of harassment if the harassment was founded, but also even if the harassment was unfounded or undetermined, that they must report complaints of retaliation. And so we'll be checking up, and that you be very clear in your training with everyone about the anti-retaliation part of making complaints, and in your supervisor's training that you really, really, really be clear about their responsibility to not retaliate, even if the complaint is against them, because complaints of retaliation are separate investigations, and the finding of the original complaint, as we already covered before, is not determinative of whether retaliation has occurred. So we educate everybody regarding retaliation. We educate the complainant and the accused again at the closure meeting. We proactively check in with the complainant, sorry, typo, and even witnesses. We monitor the files. We'll, depending on the circumstances, perhaps even consider notifying upper level supervisors to monitor, because if we don't shut down retaliation, we might dodge a lawsuit, but there's a chilling effect of reporting and cooperation later on, and we might not dodge the next one. So retaliation defined as any material adverse action taken because an employee engaged in protected activity, in this case making a harassment or discrimination complaint, even if they did it on behalf of another employee or they participated as a witness in a workplace investigation. So you have three, where's my little diagram? You have, I'll go back, three elements to a claim of retaliation. First, you have protected activity, which we just covered on that slide. So basically, anytime anybody makes a complaint or serves as a witness in someone else's complaint, you have that first leg of a charge of retaliation thrown down right there. And if you have some type of adverse action and there's a causal connection with that protected activity, then you have everything that you need for a charge of retaliation. So employers face two principal questions. What type of employee conduct is protected? Certainly complaints of harassment and discrimination, and whether the incident that negatively affected the employee is connected to the protected activity. And these days, if the employee was treated in a way that negatively affected them or would dissuade them or other employees in similar circumstances from coming forward, that can be enough of an adverse action to trigger a retaliation claim. So it's really important that all managers document the work performance of all employees, high performing, low performing, in between performing, that work for them from the day that they begin the employment relationship, whether they hire the person, inherit the person, or take over a new department. Because if there is a problem later on and you have poor documentation, you can, or no documentation, and then all of a sudden a slew of documentation on somebody's work performance, it creates suspicious circumstances, because employees have a lot of protections. And then if you have no documentation as to their work performance and some type of protected event activity occurs, it's going to be very difficult to manage anyone after that. And a lot of times I'll ask, though, why didn't you manage before the complaint? Why are you managing now? Someone I went I had a webinar on FMLA, and they said somebody sent me a message that said, we have one of our supervisors wants to write an employee up now that she's returned from FMLA. How can we do that and it appear non-retaliatory? And I said, well, was there something that he discovered while she was out on FMLA leave that he didn't know before? And they said, no, he just never got around to it. And I said, well, there's really no way that you're going to be able to write it up that it couldn't be perceived as being retaliatory. I mean, if you were the employee, you'd think that as well, wouldn't you? And then what is the supervisor's defense to that? I'm a sloppy supervisor. And I said, well, has she been written up for this before? And no, well, what? Then I said, then I would ask, why didn't you manage before the FMLA leave? Why do they want to manage now? Honestly, is the supervisor mad? Because it looks like it, and if it was us, we would feel like it. And so it's difficult. All right, reasonable care. All right. And our friends at the EEOC go on to say, even the best policy and complaint procedure alone is not going to satisfy the burden of providing reasonable care if in the particular circumstances of a claim, the employer failed to implement its processes effectively, do what it said it was going to do. If, for example, the employer has an adequate policy and complaint procedure and properly responded to an employee's complaint, but management ignored previous complaints by other employees about the same harasser, then the employer has not exercised reasonable care in preventing the harassment. There are no safe harbors for employers based on written content of policies and procedures. Similarly, if the employer has an adequate policy and complaint procedure, but failed to carry out their responsibility to conduct an effective investigation, the employer has not discharged its duty to exercise reasonable care. But they also point out that alternately, lack of a formal policy and complaint procedure doesn't defeat the defense if the employer actually did exercise sufficient care through other means. So having a really great policies and procedures don't matter if you don't follow them. And being able, even if you didn't have a policy and a complaint procedure, but you actually did address it properly, that would in effect, in some respects, be better. And just because you finally stepped in and addressed it for one person, that doesn't mean it's particularly over. But at the same time, if you investigate, say 3 times somebody, and all 3 times you determine that, yeah, this is founded, then basically as an employer, you've just left 3 investigations that show, yeah, we know that this person's been doing it, and we're not doing enough to stop them from doing it. Otherwise, that we would have stopped that conduct after the first investigation that we determined it was founded. So really, you just leave a trail of documentation as a stick to hit you with. So when it's determined that it's been founded, you need to take action enough to make that conduct stop. The Americans with Disabilities Act, at its heart, is anti-discrimination law, but also protects employees from being harassed because of their disabilities. The law makes it illegal to discriminate against a qualified person with a disability in the private and public sector and state and local governments. Once again, anti-retaliation language. The law also requires that employers reasonably accommodate known physical or mental limitations of people who are otherwise qualified to do the jobs, whether they're an applicant or employee, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. And once again, don't forget state laws. We already ran through California earlier, but also protected from being harassed if I have a disability. And so That could even be so simple as my employer provides, say, more leave than is required by existing leave policies, or provides me a, say, a more flexible schedule as to start time, and the other employers are giving me a hard time about it. Well, there's nothing in the ADA that the other employees not liking it makes it an undue hardship. No, there's nothing in there about that. So in that way, that might be an example of how somebody might be harassed under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Equal Pay Act makes it illegal to pay different wages to men and women if they perform equal work in the same workplace. Work considered that of the same accountability, responsibility, and working conditions, also anti-retaliation language, and don't forget state laws. California, bless your heart, you are definitely taking up the torch to combat systemic pay discrimination, and my hat goes off to you. All right, also from the EEOC, Age Discrimination Employment Act protects people who are 40 or older from discrimination or harassment because of age, anti-retaliation language as well. Don't forget state laws. Hey, what about your employees' rights to free speech under the Constitution? Well, you know, in the private sector workplace, you don't have a lot of them. You don't. You have more in the public sector, but you still don't have free speech rights to harass each other. And what free speech rights that employees have in the private sector workplace are largely governed by the National Labor Relations Act, which the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 that was a long time ago. Employees didn't have any employment protections back then. And so really the only rights that they had was the right to band together as a group, the idea of collectivism. And so the National Labor Relations Act is the law that gives employees the right to determine collectively whether they need to elect to either form an entity or to elect an entity on their behalf to bargain between the employees and the employer. So therefore, the idea of being able to discuss our working conditions is really important under this particular law, because otherwise, how would we determine if we needed to band together or to elect a aforementioned entity? So the right to discuss our working conditions is the 7th section of the National Labor Relations Act. And so it gives employees the right to discuss their working conditions. It also gives, and working conditions are also such things as complaints and those types of things. So the National Labor Relations Board, which interprets the National Labor Relations Act, said many years ago that, hey, employer, unless you have some right, unless you have some reason, which is a specific safety or security reason, like a real one, you know, not just one you made up so they won't gossip, unless you have a specific safety or security reason, you can't prohibit employees from discussing their employee complaints. And the EEOC came out right afterwards and reissued a position statement that said, for the laws that we administer, we have always considered requiring employees to keep their complaints confidential to be a form of retaliation. However, we do require employers, when investigating the complaints, to be as discreet to the extent possible. Okay. Now, you as the employer, you probably have a policy that is much broader than the law in regards to your harassment policy, your ethics policy, respect in the workplace policies. All those policies go above and beyond what the law requires of employers, and you can do that. You can do that. You can write an employer policy that overrides someone's constitutionally protected free speech rights, because, you know, if they always have a choice. Now, when I say public sector employees have a few more free speech rights, they do in many respects. They have some it depends on what type of public sector. They can have some property rights to their jobs as well. And, you know, a lot of those free speech rights are more in regards to political speech and that type of thing. All right. Employees give you all kinds of excuses. I'm sorry they are offended, which is like, you know, not an apology at all. They never said it bothered them. Well, they didn't have to. You should have conducted your speech in accordance with our policy. not conduct your speech in regards to what your coworkers would complain about. That's just how I am. Okay, so that's just how you are, and it's not in accordance with how we want you to be. So then you need to make some changes. I mean, that's kind of admitting it, right? That's how I am. They often do that with touching. Touching is bad in the workplace. Touching that people don't, unwanted touching. And so when you say that's just how I am, I'm a touchy-feely person, well, then you're basically admitting to me at that particular point that that some people are likely that are unwelcome with some people, but you're expecting to get a pass for it, is what I hear them say then. They need to get over it. No, you need to change your conduct. They are oversensitive. Well, no, that's an opinion. That might be your opinion, but the overriding determination here is your conduct in accordance with our policy? And if your conduct is not in accordance with our policy, it doesn't matter how anyone is, how sensitive they are, or how not sensitive they are. The issue is your conduct in accordance with our policy. They're not in alignment here. I act like that to everyone. Okay, well, that's no pass. Time to stop again. So you kind of see how this goes. They have a problem. They're this, they're that, they're what have you. Well, be that as it may, we have a problem with your conduct. It's not in accordance with our policy. And how they are is not at issue here. How you are is what's at issue here. I didn't mean it. Okay, what did you mean? We were at lunch talking between ourselves. Okay, you were at lunch. Were you at lunch in our lunchroom? So then you're bringing it here, and people have a right to eat their lunch without overhearing that which offends them. So maybe you two need to get in the car and drive somewhere to have lunch. At the same time, remembering maybe they don't welcome it either. Maybe they just like you and you're their friend, and they're just tolerating it, and realize that one day you may cross the line, or they may get a different worldview of things, whether it's religion or politics or what have you. They get a different worldview, and then all of a sudden it's not okay anymore. They want me to fail. Okay, what's if you're not abiding, the easiest way to not fail at work is to abide by our policies or procedures. So if you're not abiding by our policies or procedures, then you're setting yourself up to fail. I just want them to work. Okay, well, they probably want to work too, and they have a right to work without being in a type of harassing environment. And, using disrespectful speech really never made anybody work harder or motivated anybody. So it's all about the receiving. And so what is okay between other people and other circumstances is not okay between other people or other circumstances. And it's okay until it's not. Bystanders may not be okay. We can't assume it's not okay just because someone's not complaining. And as we said, it's all okay until it's not, or something changes. We all are just equal our experiences. We all are diverse. We equal our experiences. So in your training for all your employees, you need to be very clear about conduct. Teach from the policy about that they know how to report, and they know that they have to report. Not that they're encouraged to report, but they have a responsibility to report harassing behavior. And I would also include what happens in an investigation, and based on whatever your current investigatory protocols are. And if you don't have any, that's a different webinar and you need to get them. However, most training stops with, and then you'll report, and then there will be an investigation. And you almost hear like the dunk dunk from Law and Order. And you can see everybody's face go, oh, geez, I don't want any part of that. But what if you went on to say, and when you come to complain, we'll have a form that you fill out. We'll ask you to bring any evidence. So if you have jotted these incidents down in a journal, or you have text or pictures or what have you, bring those, because we're going to ask for those. We're going to ask you who you want us to talk to, and what you want us to ask them, and what's the source of that particular information. So we're going to ask you for individuals who may have information on the situation, and you just run them through your procedure. So then it takes away that mystery of the unknown. And you also include throughout your training for all employees the non-retaliation concept of which we've been talking all along. For supervisors, we add in their responsibilities regarding reporting. And I do that by showing them that two-part affirmative defense and the responsibilities that the Supreme Court has put on supervisors, that you just can't hide behind it anymore, that you are put on you are held to a higher standard of conduct, and that you have responsibilities to the company in reporting, and that you can create legal risks for the company if you don't, that you could jeopardize your job if you are named as someone to report to and employees report to you and you don't follow the investigatory protocols to pass that complaint on as outlined in our procedure, then you can jeopardize your very job. And I go through all the ways that, like we've been discussing, that they create risk, and that they're not just one of the guys or one of the gals, as the saying goes, that they have that higher standard of conduct and that how they set the tone. I point out retaliation leaves a paper trail, because it almost always does, right? And what their role is in investigations, to provide witnesses when we need to interview them, to not interfere, to not pump people as to what they told us. That's can be a form of retaliation right there. How they can be really helpful to us in regards to how their employees are interacting during the investigation. And if it's themselves when it's being reported, none of this changes. You still don't have any right to interfere in the investigation, which is what you do when you're not making people available for witnesses. You're telling them, you're trying to sway or interfere with what your employees tell the investigator. You're pumping them when they come back as to what they told the investigator and they don't want to talk to you. That's all interference. So when it comes to reporting, define the terms. Who is the management team? And point out again to the employees the responsibility to report. Retaliation, how they have protection, and the process to report, which should be the same as the process to report the discrimination or the harassment. Who to conduct, and that not that they're encouraged to report, but they have a responsibility to report. And then you include in your protocol what occurs in an investigation, and point out the part of the policy, which I hope is in there in your harassment and discrimination policy, about all employees are required to cooperate in investigations and fact findings. So a training review, what we covered, just consider, you don't have to break the law to violate the policy. There aren't a lot of passes given these days. Diversity dinosaurs, the people that insult everyone, and then it's supposed to be like some kind of, well, it wasn't personal, I insult everyone. Those are extinct. And keep your hands to yourself has been taught since kindergarten. So I don't think it's any surprise that when you're 44 years old and working for an employer, we would expect the same. Complaints and investigations, how to report, the process, what happens, the fact finding, to bring the evidence, the witnesses, no retaliation. We'll meet up with you afterwards to explain our findings, and afterwards we're not going to tolerate any retaliation, how you report that. And so explaining this, we're not going to tolerate retaliation, is critical. And if you're a supervisor, realize you set the tone. That's your brand. Your department reflects you. So it's, these things are, it's not just between us. There's never anything just between us. Don't assume your particular brand of conduct is okay, just because there's a power imbalance there. Your employees are not going to tell you you're out of line, to your face, generally speaking. There's a power imbalance. Women can harass too. For some reason, they don't seem to think that they can harass men. It's only men who harass women. That's not true. Women can harass too. And also that if someone tells you to knock it off, though, thank them, then stop. Don't retaliate. Sometimes a coworker will do a good thing by one of their coworkers and say, hey, you're out of line. And instead of saying, thanks for telling me, and then stopping it, instead, they try and get all their coworkers, she's oversensitive and this and what. And then they not only they know that their conduct's unwelcome at that point, then they retaliate against that person. Instead, they should thank them. They gave them a pass, basically. How to handle employee complaints. Thank them. Take them seriously. Is there a policy with a reporting procedure? Follow it to the letter. Don't stop to think about it. Just follow it, because you can create a risk, as we've seen, for the company if you don't follow the reporting procedure. That kind of puts you in a precarious position, because sometimes you're not passing it on can create a more high dollar risk than what the employee is alleging over there. Is there a law? You think there might be a law? Call HR. Is it about you, your supervisor, your best buddy at work? Doesn't matter. Is it safety related? Take the equipment out of service until you can determine, is it equipment error or is it user error? Because you don't want, until you don't want the chance that somebody might use that equipment until you know it's safe. Investigate before returning employees to work. Just notify whoever's in charge of safety. If you don't know what to do, smart people ask questions. Don't be shy to pick up the phone. Call HR, call your boss, call corporate, call legal, call somebody. Smart people ask questions. Don't retaliate, even if you don't believe or like the employee. All right, taking a complaint. Whenever you have somebody, there's always somebody who provides information that starts an investigation, and we call them the reporter. And sometimes they might not even work for your company. They could be a vendor, or it could be somebody who, or it could be an employee that actually complains on somebody else's behalf. So you don't always have a direct complainant. You might have an indirect complainant. However, a witness is anyone who provides information. So the reporter is also a witness. Anyone who makes a direct complaint is a witness. Anyone who makes an indirect complaint is a witness. So anybody who provides information, regardless of their role, is a witness. And anyone who takes these complaints should know your company protocols. You definitely want to consider a simple form. Thank the employee for coming to you. Tell them they're in the right place. A large part of a simple form is having a space for the employee to write their situation down. Even if you don't have a form, you listen to what they tell you, you take notes, you pay specific attention to things like locations and times and other people who were there and evidence when they mention like texts or he left me a voicemail or whatever. You pay particular, because you're going to ask for that evidence later on. And so the employee tells you that, and then you say, okay, thank you for coming. You've got to the right place. Here's our process. You've given me a lot of information. I want to pay this attention, the attention it deserves. So our protocol is to have you write it down, at which point you can get your form out, or you can just have them write it down on a piece of paper. Give them plenty of time to take it down. Then you go through their complaint with them, line by line, and you edit appropriately. If they change a location from the lunchroom to the parking lot, then you write, upon review, change location from the lunchroom to the parking lot. You don't strike it out, because that's something you want to ask about, why the first time was the lunchroom and the second time the parking lot. If they won't or they can't write it down, you write it down for them on the form or on a piece of paper, and then go through it verbatim again with them and edit appropriately. You may want to go at that point, get your policy out and say, let's take a look and review our policy. So you can then point out your anti-retaliation language in there and give them the policy. Sometimes this is helpful with employees who say that they've been harassed, but they just feel like it or what have you. Sometimes then you can get the policy out and say, well, let's do a little policy review first. And then they can, kind of, because when employees come to you and give you a complaint, they're very usually high emotion. They'll tell you how they felt, and that's important, but you got to find out what happened. If you fail to take an accurate initial complaint, it can compromise the whole investigation. It takes on an average 2 to 3 hours to take an accurate initial complaint. If you are 24/7, there needs to be somebody on shift to take complaints, all shifts, unless you really like getting up and running down to the plant in the middle of the night. And whoever takes those complaints should be trained in how to take the complaints and know that that complaint needs to be under, say, HR's door before they leave the plant that day, and that they need to ask the employees, do you feel safe going back to work? And if they don't, they can find something for them in the office to do, and then they can call you and ask for guidance. So ask for that mentioned evidence when they're giving you the complaint. He left me a voicemail. He sent me a text. Do you have that? Did you take a picture of it? Social media, you don't want to violate any state laws in regards to social media, but sometimes people will get harassed at work, and then they'll get harassed later on, and they'll say, look what they sent me on Facebook. And if it's their Facebook, then I have no problem with that. And you're like, but that happened outside of work. Well, if it's coming back into the workplace, then this is being brought back into the workplace, and now it's our problem. And this isn't so much that it happened outside of the workplace, is this is evidence to support what the person says is happening in the workplace as well. So, and ask them for witnesses. Who do you want me to talk to? What do you want me to ask them? What's the source of that information? Make sure you confirm your quotes at least a couple times, and then mark them as that. Intermediate measures. If someone says to you something such as, I can't work here until you get to the bottom of this, I need to go to the South Side branch, and they live and work up on the North Side, I would have them write you a short little note, because you never want to do anything to the person making the complaint that could be considered retaliatory later on. All right, so our goal then with our interview questions for everyone that we talk to is to recreate the situations, gather up any evidence, and get some accurate, applicable facts, which means what we call the 5 W's and an H: who and what and where and when and how and why. And so what occurred? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Who was present? Who else may know relevant information? How did it happen? Who did or said what? In what order? Why did it happen? Could it have been avoided? Do you have any notes, documents, pictures, other evidence? And always start out by asking people what was observed, because sometimes people will hear things, but they didn't see it. And we kind of have a natural inclination to, like, what'd you see? Well, if an employee doesn't want to tell you what they heard and they didn't see anything, then a lot of people will say nothing. So ask what was observed. There's always, always drives me crazy. Like, you go to a training and they make it seem like there's going to be one joke and all your employees are going to be cooperative with you and nobody's going to retaliate against anyone. But usually when an employee comes to you, they've often been hoping it would stop. And so they complain, and there's different issues and elements and occurrences. And under each one of those things that you can break it down, sometimes you can break it down by policy issue. Sometimes you can break it down by different things that happened, or they're all the same thing that happened and all the same policy issue, but there are different occurrences that happen. And so you need to break that down. You need to take that big complaint and break it down into varying levels of detail, and then capture the 5 W's and the H for every occurrence, for each element, under each issue. And so sometimes you may need a second investigation. You ask an employee, do you know why I want to talk to you? And they say, is it about the Pergo disappearing off the back loading dock? And it's not. It's about, Bob harassing Sally. Well, that's a second investigation. If you get a claim of retaliation at any time during the investigation, that's a second investigation. And you don't wait for the first investigation to have closure until you investigate the claim of retaliation, for 2 reasons. One, we already know that whether or not retaliation occurred is not determined by the initial finding of the first complaint. And if you don't step in and investigate, it could just get worse and worse and worse. You got to give people time, because they're often very vague in their recollections. They experience it in their own way. They didn't know they were supposed to be keeping track of it that day. So they're not video units. Give them time to recall it in their own way, at least 8 seconds to get an answer. And so you always want to set aside more time than you think you'll need. No opinions, no agreements. Don't assume. Don't record your opinions, and we already talked about why you need to avoid blanket statements for requiring confidentiality. A blanket statement means you don't have any specific safety or security reason to require confidentiality. You just tell everybody to do that, or you just require that of everyone, and we already talked about why you want to avoid those blanket statements. You want to avoid the no good answer question. Are you an anything goes manager, or are you a totally by the book all the time, no matter what manager? I don't know. You don't want to ask two questions in one. Leading questions are the most common because we're in a hurry. You want to avoid accusatory questions. Why didn't you report this any sooner? Because now you're putting it, you're blaming the person who came to complain, and that provides you no usable information, because what you really want to know is, did you know how to report? And if they did they report? And they often did. So you want to know, because you got a secondary issue here, right? To whom did you report? And did they dissuade you? Did they encourage you as to any course of action? And you want to find out if they dissuaded them from coming forward, because you might have an employee, which is often the case, who has reported it to some member of management who had responsibilities to bring it forward, but they didn't follow the policy. They did what they wanted to do. So you want to avoid accusatory questions for those two reasons. Open-ended, who, what, where, when, how, and why most of the time. Closed-ended, to force an answer, to get to clarify a detail, or sometimes you can use it for, I'll always tell employees, give me as much information as possible so I can experience it the same way you did. And they start off telling me all kinds of stuff about their day and where they went to lunch, and their lunch was bad, and just on and on and on and on. And so I'll ask them a closed-end question. So it was lunchtime on October 28th, Monday. Yes, it was. Okay. And see, then now you can kind of go in the direction you want to. Because when you shut people down, I don't need to know all that. Then they think, well, you told me to give you as much information. I don't know what you need to know. So, and then once you kind of get somebody going, just let them kind of, and then what happened, and then what happened, and then what happened. And so you want to go methodical, slow, and specific, easy. You want to keep a neutral show of yourself. And what I mean by that is, when we concentrate, because it requires a lot of active listening, most of us furrow our brow, we clench our pen, we like hunch our shoulders, we look tense. And that tends to make people not open up to us. So you want to be neutral. You don't want to react, but you want to make sure that you're not doing your usual hunker down and concentrate look. Maps and diagrams. When we hear a lot of visual information, our brain tries to match it up with something that we've experienced in the past. So we may not be, he was here and then she was here and then they went there. And so we may not be getting that exactly right. So ask them to draw you a map or a diagram, one diagram per witness. We don't show other witnesses other people's maps or diagrams, generally for the same reason as we don't tell people what other witnesses said. We'll either change their testimony, it'll rub off on them, or if somebody's lying to us, then that allows them to get their lies straight. So one map or diagram per witness, and then go visit the scene. If she's a size 2 and he's a size 32 and there's 15 feet between them, why is he always bumping into her when she's leaving the cubicle? But if he's a big gal and she's a big girl, and there's only or if he's a big guy and she's a big gal and there's only 2 feet between them, there might be something to his story that he's boxed down in the canyon and he can't get out without thumping into her. So go look. And then ask for other witnesses. We already covered that. I want to know, did they know the reporting procedure? Because see, that's, as we know from looking at that affirmative defense, that's a really important part of limiting our liability. So at the same time, we want to think reports are good. They give us a chance to fix things at the lowest level before somebody outside our organization comes in and makes us fix them in the way they want, which may not be the way we want to go. So did they report prior? To whom? The obligations of that person. Were they advised as to any course of action? And if they knew the policy and they didn't report it, then I'll ask them, okay, so it sounds like you knew the policy and you didn't report. Can you help me understand the reason that you didn't report? Not why didn't you report? I'd like to know if anyone with my witnesses has Sally complains and she says Bob's harassing her, go talk to Janet. Okay. I'd like to know of Janet. Has anyone talked with her before coming to the meeting? If yes, then who? And we go back through the 5 W's and an H. I want to know if they've been coached or threatened. And then I can discuss retaliation. I'm going to discuss retaliation with everybody, beginning and before they leave, but I can put them at ease if they were coached or threatened. And I can also find out if we've got somebody interfering in your investigation, and that's going to cause a second investigation, more than likely, depending on what they're doing. But you never do anything to put yourself in an unsafe situation. You never tell someone they can't leave the room. Law enforcement are the only people who have the right to detain people against their will. We don't. We do civil investigations. We don't do white light interrogation techniques. We don't lie to people. We don't coerce them either. But never do anything to put yourself in an unsafe situation. You can always continue the interview later. Some people use anger as a defense, but if in doubt, stop the interview, come back. Good idea to have a code word. $30 panic button off of Amazon if you take complaints. 2 ways out of the room, one for you, one for them. They can't say they were unlawfully imprisoned. Window with a curtain that you can yank back is kind of good. You want some privacy in your interviews. I like conference rooms, but don't pick the one way at the end of a dark hallway that nobody knows where it's at and nobody ever uses it. And realize when it comes to employee investigations, you're going to have management support on the hard issues. What your human resources will or should do with your complaints: review the originating complaint, review any evidence, review any files of applicable situations, review any files of persons named. They'll consider starting a chronology, which is just an overview of all the actions that they take. Most of the time, if you're a supervisor, unless you're a second or third shift supervisor, you get the person over to HR. They do all this. They do the things we've been talking about. But if you're a manager in this webinar, it's probably because HR wanted you to know why we do things the way that we do things, and why your role is of reporting and passing on complaints and not retaliating is so important to the company. We're going to ask them if they reported before. We're going to make sure they know how to contact us. We're going to determine if we need to call in legal counsel, any remedial action. Who are those who are need to know? Those are take action or make decisions. Those are the need to know. What's the potential witness in the order to interview people? So to avoid claims of supervisory interference, complaints promptly on the investigatory party's desk. Make them aware immediately. Are there any safety issues, unsafe equipment, unsafe working, unsafe people, any potential workplace violence that you're worried about? Don't destroy evidence. There's a legal concept called spoliation of evidence. And what that short story means is that if your company winds up in a lawsuit and you destroyed evidence, the inference is going to be the evidence that you destroyed or lost or damaged was that which reflected unfavorably upon your company. And worst case scenario, you might not be able to introduce the evidence that reflects favorably upon your company. No, don't attempt to sway the outcome. There's a reason why we schedule people in the order that we do. So often we will reschedule an interview, but we're not really trying to interfere with your production. Generally, the person, if you've got someone who's accused of something, they're going to be last to interview, not because we're trying to set them up. It's just we're trying to gather up all the information that we have at our disposal to determine if they're being forthcoming with us or not. But there might be reasons why we move that person up in the process. And so we really have a reason why we schedule people when we do. You don't want to interfere. You don't want to dissuade people from cooperating. You don't want to threaten. Those are all forms of retaliation. And you don't want to do anything else that can be considered retaliatory. And if you're supervising an employee performance issues who has an outstanding or recent complaint, especially if it's about you as a supervisor, then you certainly want to seek assistance from HR, legal, corporate, or whatever, how to move forward on that. Your employees who are represented by unions have the rights of employees to have union representation at investigatory interviews. Because if that information provided by the employee becomes a basis for discipline later on, they're entitled to have that union rep, not necessarily the one of their choice, although we usually try to be cooperative. Management is not required to inform the employee of their Weingarten rights, but we often will ask if we know it's an investigatory interview. We will often ask if they want their union rep there. The union rep at that point becomes somewhere between a witness and a participant. They don't have to sit there and say nothing, but they might say something like, tell her you want her to ask that question in a non-leading manner. But they say that to the employee. They don't say, you don't have to answer that question. It's a leading question. So, and when you get their employee rep for them, then they actually have a little brief moment, 5 minutes or so, to meet with their union rep without management being in the room. And if you have unions, then there also may be some requirements in your collective bargaining agreement contracts that for notification of witnesses or notification to employees that have had complaints made about them. They may require you to notify the employee of a nature of the complaint, but that's in regards to, say, sexual harassment, but that's the nature of the complaint. You don't have to give them the whole thing. And in private sector employers that don't have unions, then if you're accused of like sexual harassing somebody, you're not going to know till you show up for the interview. We talked about we didn't talk about this. Employers should make it clear to employees it'll protect the confidentiality of harassment allegations to the extent possible, but you can't guarantee complete confidentiality because you can't conduct an effective investigation without revealing certain information. So if Sally harassed Bob, Sally's name's going to come up relatively quickly because we can't do a good investigation on the behalf of Sally, the company, or Bob if we can't ask Sally about who he harassed. Records relating to harassment complaints should be kept confidential and only shared with those who need to know about it. So you could set up an informational phone line. I guess because I sell software, I'm not a big fan of phone lines because the people who were taking the tips might not be the world's most crackerjack investigators, and then you get your tips secondhand. Whereas if you have software, you can set up your form for what you want to ask, and then it comes straight to you, and you can do that on an anonymous basis. So you go straight to the horse's mouth versus somebody who you hope they ask the right questions. All right, investigations are fact findings, and there's 4 possibilities. The facts alleged have not occurred, they have occurred, we don't know, or where an intentionally false complaint has been made. I will tell you that a lot of times employers think that there are intentionally false complaints made, and they're not. They're just employees who were wrong about something. They didn't have all the information, they misread something, a miscommunication, what have you. Being wrong is not making an intentionally false complaint. Intentionally false complaints don't happen that often. Intentionally false complaints are when you say, I wanted Saturday night off to go to a party, he wouldn't give me the night off, I told him, so I made a complaint that he harassed me because I know the procedure would have been to let me go home. That's an intentionally false complaint. And even if you get that, then you still call your attorney before you take action against the employee. When your investigation is inconclusive, your investigation should show that you did everything a reasonable person would, and you can't tell. Not that you just, talked to a couple people here and there and you were done. There's a kind of sort of what I call the kind of sort of possibility. That's when you go to talk to an employee. Language is very common with this one. Somebody makes a complaint about some obnoxious remarks, and then you go to and talk to these 2 people, and you talk to both those people, and they say, well, it wasn't really that, it was really this. And those remarks are just as bad, if not worse, than the one the employee alleges. And so then your conclusion is that while the allegations cannot be confirmed in verbatim, it has been determined that there was language that occurred that violated the workplace policy. And remember, just because one allegation or incident or element is true, it doesn't mean that everything else is true or not. And as we said, the finding for a retaliation investigation is not determined by the findings of the originating complaint. So a lot of times people, like I said, are wrong, but to be malicious, you have to know that you're intentionally making a malicious false complaint for the purpose of gaining some type of advantage. If the conduct is determined to have occurred, you want assurance of immediate and appropriate corrective action. You want to take measures sufficient to stop the conduct. You want to follow up to ensure the conduct does not reoccur, correction of any harm caused as best as able, and ensure that no retaliation occurs. So we always close a loop with an employee complains. A meeting and a letter is best practice. Without divulging confidential information, we let them know the results, not the details. We generally consult with legal counsel before we let them know the details of the investigations, and that if founded, remedial steps are being taken in accordance with our policy and procedure. We give them a letter with the following, in the interest of time, what's on the screen. If we have a notification to the accused, if the person, if it's for anything other than termination, we would explain it, because if we terminate them, we're having a termination meeting. But anything other than termination, we explain the issues raised regarding the employee, the inclusions that were drawn, why we made decisions the way we did, discuss any actions being taken, clearly explain that retaliation is prohibited, grounds for further disciplinary action, that we've talked with all the other parties to notify us immediately if any retaliation against them occurs, and that we'll be monitoring. I always tell, if it's founded, or even if it's unfounded or undetermined, I always say, I cannot impress upon you enough the importance of conducting yourself in a professional manner at this time. If you undertake any conduct that is considered retaliatory in nature, we will undertake another investigation, and sometimes I'll tell them, and if that is determined, the outcome is worse than what we're discussing today, and it'll be grounds for further disciplinary action. Go through the policy again with them, and the 2 business cards is always so that the person has one to contact me and one to give to anybody else that pumps them for information and they don't want to talk to them. Unfounded or undetermined allegations. Unfounded, those are the people who usually get really hot under the collar. It's like, okay, I didn't do it. And see, now they immediately want to take revenge. Well, we would too. So you really have to put a stop on them in your conversation, that they're not going to do that. Undetermined, always make sure that they know that, we don't know if it did or it didn't happen, but if more evidence comes to our attention, we'll reopen the investigation, and that includes you too. If you have more evidence, then you bring it to us as well. But I always make them know that that doesn't mean that it's unfounded, just as much as it doesn't mean as it is founded. They often are hot under the collar for retaliation as well. It's generally not if retaliation happens. More often it's when, to whom, and how. So we're going to educate all parties. We're going to include non-retaliatory education in our training. We're going to include what happens in an investigation and workplace training, because you can never underestimate the ability of intelligent, highly placed individuals from taking completely crazy, over the top, and obvious revenge against a complainant or a witness, because it's an ego thing. You'll even hear him say, who does he think he is? Who does she think she is? Okay. All right. After the investigation, if merited, monitor that the conduct is stopped. Regardless of the investigatory finding, monitor retaliation from those making a complaint or serving as a witness. Check in proactively with your complainant after the investigation, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months. Document those contacts. Monitor the complainants and witness files for up to a year afterwards. Documenting those contacts. We're going to train supervisors and managers. We're going to, if we can, we're going to use our supervisors and management be our eyes in the skies for retaliation. But if the complaint was against them, we're not. And we're going to document all our conducts, and we're going to educate everyone of their responsibility to report retaliation. We've already covered everything on this particular slide. Common mistakes. Snap judgments, depending on body language. I didn't even cover body language in here, did I? Yeah, because you don't want to be sitting in a deposition explaining your understanding of body language. FBI and CIA, they study it all the time. They'll tell you they can be wrong too. So depending on body language is just, don't write it down. That's just your opinion. And they might be reacting to your body language because you're sitting there all hunched up concentrating. Also, there's a power imbalance occurring in the room. They can be reacting to that, and you don't know if their spouse asked them for a divorce that morning. That might be why they're acting weird. Do not even head down that road of body language. You fail to separate the issues. You try and investigate the whole thing as one great big mess, and you miss a lot. You fail to meet your obligations to employees. You fail to ask the hard questions, or you allow someone to not answer. They start talking about something else. They just don't answer the question. They get mad. You let them not answer the question. You try to investigate up the organizational chart without support. You need support to investigate up, someone higher up than them. You allow usually someone higher up the food chart than you to take over the interview. We don't schedule adequate time. It's like webinars. I never schedule adequate time. You use white light interrogation techniques that you might have picked up from the same TV show that you got your body language from. We do civil investigations, not criminal investigations. That's where they use white light interrogation techniques. Criminal investigations. You fail to prepare, you try to be slick, you make blanket statements of confidentiality, you interview in groups, you just pull everybody into a room, you fail to examine evidence before the interview, such as time cards. So when the employee says, I wasn't there, if you'd had the time card, you would have known, yes, you were. Failing to ask for evidence during taking of a complaint, not asking for witnesses, not reviewing the premises where conduct occurred, the idea of they're innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not a capital crimes case. We're not sending somebody to the death chair. The preponderance of the firsthand evidence is what you make decisions on in internal investigations, or we fail to educate or protect regarding retaliation. And then since I'm out of time, I'm going to let you, which really, these are all pretty clear slides, and we have basically talked about everything in there, but these are all readme slides anyway. I almost left these out, but I thought, well, if we get to the point where we're too far out of time, I'll just tell you, you can just read them because they're very clear. And just some role models of, because you want to on that, you kind of want to stop on a good note when you're talking about all this kind of behavior. So let's just review. Our first line of defense is to create a culture where we treat everybody with respect. And we want upper management to set the tone. Our second line of defense is a sincere and clear, authentic policy. We make it easy to report. We want to be able to go out around our supervisors, easy to report, narrow enough that we get all the reports. And easy enough to go, and you can go out and around your boss. Hard to retaliate. We want our third line of defense is regularly scheduled training using clear, relevant examples, teach from our policies, and make sure that our supervisors are clear on their responsibilities. Our fourth line of defense is to encourage complaints. It gives us a chance to fix what's wrong. And we do in investigations, we do prompt, thorough, good faith investigations by competent, logical persons. Our fifth line of defense is to take action if warranted, depending on the outcome of our investigation. And regardless of the outcome of our investigation, it's never a bad idea to do remedial training. Our sixth line of defense is no retaliation. And if systemic changes that need to be made or identified by our investigations, then we want to take those systemic changes promptly. Okay, so I went 5 minutes over, and I apologize for that. I do not see any questions in my chat area, so I'm going to turn this back over to our moderator, and I'm just going to wish you to have a great day. And thanks for allowing me to present. And I'm going to turn this back over to our moderator and allow him one last chance to ask questions, and if not, to close up. Moderator, back over to you.
All right. Well, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Yes, attendees, now we are open for questions. So if you